Thank you, Louis Medanik. I used to run your program in 1999 and 2000, so it's great being home. Um, I'm curious, there was a great article yesterday in the Washington Post about the mayor ballot in, I think, a town in Ulyanovsk. And there seems to be a lot riding on it. First time I actually read about it, so it was quite interesting. It's a two-part question. What do you see about that contest and the recent mayoral and the recent lower level contests that have taken place? And really, for State Department, I don't know, well, first of all, I'm Louis Medanik. I'm now with the Open World Program. And the second question is, the real hate and anger at America seems to have reached a fever pitch, particularly our new ambassador, who you've replaced on the human rights, and Mr. Surkov has now been replaced, has really been taking a major hit. And I've never known a bigger fan and somebody more passionate about the success of Russia. Do you sense this is going to decline further, or is now that Mr. Putin has gotten his position, maybe some consolidation and some? I mean, I think we're all trying to get along here with this reset and do it. And I think you've been very positive. The statements in America has been very positive. Maybe I'm biased being an American and seeing things the way I do, but maybe you can comment from the Russian side. Why is there so much hostility, or how can we get to a better ground? That's the first part of the question is, what do you see of these current elections, the new election cycles for smaller level elections? And the second is, how can we cease the hostilities, the anger, and get to a better ground? So that's my two-part question. Thank you.
And specifically, you mean the runoff in Yaroslav?
Was it Yaroslav? I think I said Ulyanovsk. Yes, in Yaroslav. Yeah, the gentleman who's running for mayor who was featured in the Washington Post article yesterday.
Right, yeah, runoff on the 1st, I believe.
Yeah.
Well, it has to be important it was in the Washington Post. Yes, I'd make 2 points about these local elections. First, it seems to me what they are demonstrating, and this is the third I've read about. There are 2 previous elections, one in Tolyatti and one in a town called Chernigolovka, in which United Russia candidates were defeated, and pretty roundly. One of the reports I read said that United Russia was even toxic as an appellation in the campaign. And you have something the same going on here, potentially, in Yaroslav. It seems to me it says 2 or 3 things. One, it says that there are new people prepared to challenge the powers that have been and the ones who have run things up to now. And you'll notice in the article on Yaroslav, the fellow who's the mayor has been there since Soviet period. He's an experienced mayor. But he's retiring. So this was an open contest, in theory. And you therefore didn't have the usual of the incumbent running it. So, I mean, it's a bit of an open contest, and here I suspect the United Russia situation of being known as the party of thieves and rogues, in a sense, isn't helping. How profoundly this is going to affect things, I think it's hard to know. But what's interesting about these elections is that local issues are what seem to be at the core. People really are worried about what's going on in town. The roads are miserable, the schools aren't funded right. It's Tip O'Neill's maxim, all politics is local. And in some sense, what's interesting, I think, is that that's now playing out in a number of places where United Russia no longer seems able to project itself effectively down. I mean, that's what I make of it. I think it also says that the United Russia brand is finished. If they can't do it in local elections like this, it's pretty tough. On the anti-Americanism and so forth, I think it's a little early to tell what's happening. In fact, what I understood is we're getting mixed signals from Moscow. It's just politics. Don't worry about it. We want everything to go on as it has been. We're for reset and so on. That was the private message. The public message is what you were reading about in the media. Well, I hope so. But it's hard to go, in some sense, to the lengths that some of the anti-Americanism and the attacks on Mike McFaul and so forth have reached, and simply take it back. Say, well, you shouldn't pay any attention. Now, there aren't many societies who could take it back. Russia may be one of them, if there's a determination to do it. But the anti-American card is still there, and it strikes a resonant chord when played. And I think it's something we have to take very seriously. And I think it means, again, that one has to think very carefully about how you engage with Russia and how you deal with them. On this, it's not to, I would say, give in at all to the kind of demagoguery that we've seen. On the other hand, you have to be sensitive to the fact that it does exist and that there's no point in feeding it.
On anti-Americanism, well, I would note that if you look at the collective tone that's come out of this country, not just from the State Department and the White House, but from this country and from Washington, there's been a considerable amount of invective and venom. When I spoke earlier about the demonization of Vladimir Putin, I was including Washington in that process. And some of it's become really quite ad hominem, quite personal. Now, again, I'm on record as having criticized Putin's administration in many, many fields. But former boss of mine and of Jim's, Jack Matlock, who worked for President Reagan, likes to remind people that Reagan never advocated regime change in Moscow. He was interested in regime behavior change. And I think that's a distinction that gets lost sometimes in American attitude towards other countries. Because a reaction against American perceived intrusiveness is something we've seen recently, not just in Russia, but for example, in Egypt. And I think much of what has come out of this country toward Russia in the last 6 months has not been well received even by the people who've been out on the street demonstrating against their own government. It's seen as condescending. And in the same way that people went out on the streets in the bitter cold because they felt they had been insulted by their own political structures, I don't think they very much appreciate being insulted by foreigners either.
The anti-Americanism that emerged in the last few months and took on a very personal tone with Ambassador McFaul is really unacceptable. It's beneath the kind of country that Russia could become. And it will make it difficult for us to continue to do all the things we do if that continues. But it's important to say that we have continued the wide range of engagements that we have with Russia throughout this period. Ambassador McFaul himself was going in to see very senior people in the government to talk about a whole range of things like what's happening at the United Nations, what the plans are for the G8 meeting that's coming up in May here. There was a certain amount of business as usual going on, even while his face was appearing on some of these really malicious broadcasts and videos and so on. So Mike is as I think was said earlier, has wanted for a long time to see Russia succeed. He's passionate about Russia and its success, and he's engaging with them very vigorously in his new role. He will continue to do that, and we will continue to do that. But it's really beneath the kind of country that Russia could be and should be to resort to that. And we've raised it with them, and we'll continue to do that. But this is, as I said earlier, it's a complex, multifaceted relationship in which we are doing a lot of different things. And so we will continue to look for ways to be true to our principles and our interests, even as we're trying to listen carefully to their statements of what their interests are and where the common ground can be and where we can build it out to be more overlap and more common ground. It'll be interesting on the question of local elections, and sort of the future of the political process in Russia. There's two major pieces of legislation that are pending now in the Duma. One, reinstituting the direct election of governors, which would allow independent candidates and those represented by parties to run for the governor's post. We'll see how that emerges in the end, if that's the new law that comes back and those elections start again. Similarly, there's a new law pending that was proposed by President Medvedev soon after the December 4 elections that would make it easier for parties to register and get on the ballot. That will be very important. We've already seen some administrative decisions that kind of cut both ways, allowing the Republican Party to regain its status and continuing to deny Parnas its status. So we will watch those. Because Russia has so many elections that happen throughout the year and every year, there'll be a lot of opportunities to see how the political competition emerges, whether these laws, A, get enacted and how they get enacted, and then what that means for political competition in Russia at the municipal, regional level over these next couple of years. So, we'll see what the new normal is in Russia in terms of elections and competition.
I'm being told that we have a question submitted by a viewer watching the live webcast to submit electronically. Yes.
Yes, the person who wrote it is Andrew Olson. He's the resident country director for Belarus from the International Republican Institute. And he has two questions. First, he wants to know, do you expect the Russian government to follow through on its threats to end certain U.S. government programs related to civil society and political party programming, or was this just rhetoric by Putin to stoke and appease the nationalists? And the second question is, what of the Eurasian Union? President Putin has made statements concerning the near abroad and that it will be a high priority. How should U.S. policy balance desires for better relations and a possibly expansionist Russia?
Well, I'll go first this time. On the Eurasian Union, I was around when the Commonwealth of Independent States was first created. And since that time, I have lost track of the number of initiatives of a multilateral character within the framework of the former Soviet Union. And the number that have actually amounted to anything is in very low single digits. The problem with the Eurasian Union and why it cannot be like a European Union is because there is one country that's bigger than all the others combined, not just in territory, but in population and economy. You can't have a union in which one component is so big. That's why NAFTA cannot become a union. And I think if this Eurasian Union were ever to be seriously pushed by Moscow, you'd start seeing some serious pushback. But what most of the other capitals in the CIS know is that this is mostly words, and they don't have to take it. They don't have to take it too seriously. Now, that being said, I think there is real potential for multilateral cooperation on customs unions and various other kinds of things in the former Soviet space, largely because Soviet central planning created structures, electricity, movement, railways, all kinds of things that do require a considerable amount of cross-border economic cooperation, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think there's anything wrong with people being able to cross borders more freely than they do. But I note that in the articles which Mr. Putin published as part of his political campaign, in one of them he advocated a Eurasian Union with visa-free travel. In another one of those papers, he advocated a severe strengthening of the Russian visa regime with its neighbors. And so I would argue that to some degree one should look at how governments act, not entirely in terms of what governments say.
On the question of whether there will be efforts to disrupt or stop the assistance efforts, again, we'll see how the rhetoric translates into action. We've been very transparent about what our programs are, that USAID funds and supports, and what else happens, with American support to civil society in Russia. most of those programs have gone forward, unhindered over the last couple of years, and we hope they will continue to. Part of our engagement with the Russian government is to talk about these programs and to resolve innocent questions of confusion or misinformation and try to clear that up. So we'll just see going forward whether anything changes. But they've mostly been able to go forward unobstructed in the past.
I believe there's a question in the middle here. Yes, ma'am.
Nina Japaridze, Department of Politics, University of Oxford. How likely is it that to address the concern of corruption, to deflate concerns of corruption in Russia, Putin and Medvedev will initiate the types of anti-corruption reforms that Georgia experienced after the post-Rose Revolution period, when the authority and the power of this nexus really depends on that network of corruption in Russia? Thank you.
Well, I mean, first, I would pick up from what Wayne Mary said, that you have to be careful about taking for granted what governments say or leaders say, because if you read Mr. Putin, Mr. Medvedev, pretty much any other Russian leader, they've been working to eliminate corruption for 20 years. I think, first of all, it's an extremely complex issue. It's not a simple matter of, there are just a few corrupt people who are creating a system and being venal. It goes back to the point where, as I recall very well, in the 1990s, there wasn't any real distinction between public and private. I mean, that's all fine for us. We've grown up in a society that, from the Magna Carta on, has had a distinction between the public role and what's private, and then where the lines are. There weren't any such lines in the Russian case, or in any other case in the former Soviet Union as it broke up. And so they've been patching this system together for 20 years, and not very successfully in many cases, and quite successfully in others. What it seems to me one might give one some encouragement over the coming period is that if, as I fully expect, they join the WTO and they pursue the membership in the OECD, both of these are rules-based organizations that put fairly high demands on a number of different kinds of activities across and through the society and economy that are essentially designed to curb corruption. And that may be one factor that will strengthen the hand of those who want to do something about it. The second one, I would assume, would be any movement to have more accountable government. It's hard to know whether that's going to move forward or not, and in what way. But if you do have elected governors, or you have elected mayors and so forth, people who are responsible to their constituents, and if you have an increasing reliance on the constituents' resources, their money, to provide services and so forth, they're going to have a greater interest in how that's done. What I don't think is going to be very effective is big anti-corruption campaigns. We've seen them virtually annually for the last 20 years, and they just really don't produce very much. And so I think that's a much less likely place to look for progress. What I do think we have an interest in, though, is ensuring that things like WTO and OECD, if Russia and when Russia joins them, become meaningful internally for Russia. And I think they are undertaking new obligations, and that they need to be held to those obligations. And that should have an effect on corruption over time.
I recall that Margaret Thatcher used to say that the basis for a market economy is not money, it's enforceable contract. And in many ways, that's what delineates a modern market economy, the ability to have a deal that's based on pieces of paper and being able to enforce it with lawyers and law. In traditional societies, the way you tend to do this is with kinship relationships. So that's why you see so much what we call nepotism in many developing economies. Well, in Russia and a number of other countries that came out of the misdeveloped economies of what we used to call the Second World, what you have now is the means by which contracts and deals are made is what we call corruption. Because it goes far beyond kinship relationships, because the society is too big, the economy is too big, and they don't yet have what we call enforceable contract. I would say an important aspect of moving toward that kind of an economy and away from a corruption-based economy does lie in exactly what Jim mentioned, which is working towards effective WTO standards in terms of how you deal with contractual relationships in that country. And I think Russian businessmen, even some of the wealthiest, would welcome this because it would tend to put their wealth on a more secure basis. For example, when Mr. Putin during the campaign suggested that some of the oligarchs who got very rich in the 1990s should give back a big chunk of the money, some of the reaction to that was, whoa, what does that say about property rights in the new Russia? Well, you've got to get beyond that kind of an arbitrary state-directed delineation of who owns what. That's a slow process, but I think that those of us who've been waiting for 17, 18 years for Russia to get into the WTO should want that step not to be a conclusion, but to be the start of something very real. And in fact, it's going to be much more work to make Russia in the WTO worthwhile than it was to get Russia into the WTO, which is probably kind of depressing for people in the WTO and the Department of Commerce. But that's the real work, but that's where the real payoff is.
I believe we had a question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Stephen Keat, Department of State. At the end of his presentation, Das Malia was talking about the impact on the Ukraine. I'd appreciate if everyone could talk a little bit about the impact on other countries. In particular, I'm thinking of the South Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. Armenia is going to be having May 6th elections, whether or not you see there'll be any impact. Thank you.
Well, look, I mean, I will simply say at the outset, I don't really have much basis to give you an answer in the base of any expertise in what's going on in these particular elections. But what it does seem to me is true across this whole region and much more broadly, is that all of the governing authority in each of these states is, to a greater or lesser extent, today dealing with the problem of societies where they have demands for greater voice from elements of the population or groups that are new, and that citizen activism, civil society, if you want to call it, however you want to look at it, is now a growing factor. So, I mean, it cannot be lost, for instance, in Central Asia, on the leaderships, that everybody else outside Central Asia, at least, is asking, what's the meaning of the Arab Spring for, you fill in the country? And then everybody sort of is trying to work around the question of how, well, it really doesn't have any meaning for us or whatever, or it has big meaning. I think the common sense and realistic answer is that it does have meaning, because these societies are increasingly conscious of what's happening around them and on the outside. Now, the degree to which this is going to affect elections or the political process, which is what I prefer to call it, in these different societies, I think is very much a matter of local option, if you will. That each of the societies has a different susceptibility or readiness or activism on the part of its citizens. And so it's particular in that case. But I think it's certainly the case that almost none of these societies is immune from the influence of what's happened in Moscow or what happened in Cairo or what is happening more broadly on the internet. I mean, they're all increasingly engaged with this, and that is going to have its effect. How it will play out in each case, I just am not in a position to tell, but I think this much you can say.
Yeah, I would be very cautious about assuming too much that these countries are Russia clones.
Yeah.
I think after 20 years, the political structures and political leaderships of most of these countries are pretty much their own. I don't think Islam Karimov or Ilham Aliyev, let alone Alexander Lukashenko, really much care what happens on the streets of Moscow. That does not mean that these countries are immune from what goes on in the world in general. I mean, the whole question of the example of the Arab uprising, developments in many parts of the world are important. I will never forget visiting a country in which I was at the time U.S. government's leading expert, probably because I was the only expert, which was East Germany in 1987, and finding that all of my friends there were absolutely fascinated, riveted by what they've been watching on West German television of people power in the Philippines, and wondering, could it happen here? Not that that's what they actually made happen 2 years later, but that the image, the notion that it could be done with sufficient restraint, self-control, communicating with the police, were lessons they drew. I mean, and that is sort of a Marshall McLuhan-esque experience. I would think one would find that in a place like Armenia, a place like Moldova, a place like Kyrgyzstan, you're going to find out there are multiple influences. Some of them may reflect developments in Russia. But I wouldn't give Russia kind of a, primus inter pares role. And remember that it can work in the other direction as well. I mean, the experience of what you can get away with in Kiev may play a role on what a political leadership in Moscow thinks it can get away with. When people in Moscow see a government in Budapest getting away with some things that were supposed not to be permissible within the European Union, it may lead them to wonder whether they can do sufficient things. For example, not so many years ago, there was a new Russian law on religion, on religious bodies, and many parts of it were taken verbatim from an Austrian law. So it can work the other way around. It's not just how Russia influences other countries, but how other countries can influence Russia for good or for ill. I mean, in that regard, this is a very interconnected world. But I think it's very, very difficult, even after the fact, to try to figure out what the interrelationships were. And before the fact, I think that may just be a matter of people inflating perhaps their own institutions and programs, which we all tend to do.
Yeah, most everything has just been said by my two colleagues here, but the information exchange is interactive. It goes many different directions. I guess I would offer two observations, having been in and out of Egypt in this past year as well, and thinking about the broader range of countries out to Central Asia and so on. I'd say what we've learned in the last year is that stable authoritarian regimes are stable until they're not. And we don't, and change happens at unpredictable moments and in unpredictable ways. The beginning of the Arab uprisings in Tunisia, a little over a year ago, was entirely unanticipatable the way it unfolded. And what happened later in Egypt and in Yemen and Libya and Syria, there was no plan that anybody had for any of this. And even as it was unfolding, it was hard to, I think, for experts to wrap their minds around what they were seeing happen right before their very eyes. So, what these elections in Russia mean for other countries and vice versa, I think we don't know necessarily. We can't know, but we do know that in an increasingly networked world, that everybody's watching everything else. And that's true not only of governments, but it's also true of non-governmental actors, whether journalists or civil society or political parties or business people. So it's just harder to keep a secret in the 21st century. And so I think people will take lessons from other places, and they will be learning in ways that are unpredictable.
Indeed, and one wonders what two recently elected presidents may have exchanged. The past couple of days in Moscow, we saw a 10-minute meeting between Mr. Atambayev and Mr. Putin, so perhaps not much was exchanged, but certainly that type of meeting, no doubt, important for Kyrgyz domestic consumption. I believe we had a question on this side of the room who's been waiting very patiently.
The gentleman just asked.
Oh, indeed.
Only I was going to ask more about Central Asia, but the same.
And in fact, as the questioner points out, elections, the next national elections coming up in Armenia, in the region in Armenia, the 6th of May for the National Assembly. Armenia coming, of course, off of a very problematic, most recent national election cycle back in 2008. Yes, in the back, please. Oh, I'm sorry, in the front, madam.
My name is Chris Thorpe. I'm with Democracy International. You mentioned the Golos network. Now that the elections are over, how does Golos and similar civil society organizations move forward now, especially since the vast majority of Russians view NGOs as crooks and thieves, and that there seems to be, now that the elections are over, a dampening. So what does the future look like for civil society? And thank you.
I would say it depends on the people of Golos and other people that want to be monitors of their governments and of public processes. If they want to stand up and try to hold their governments accountable and say that their governments too should obey the law, I think that's entirely in the hands of those Russians to do that. It is true that they're consistent with the anti-Americanism that emerged or that was heightened in recent months. Part of that was a vilification of NGOs and of nonprofits that accept foreign funding for their work. One of the reasons that they're dependent on foreign funding, of course, is that there is not generally otherwise funding available to do their kind of work in places like Russia. There's some available in different ways, but it has emerged as an international norm that civil society reaches out to civil society in other countries, both for learning techniques and methods, and then also, there's not just the United States, but there are dozens of governments in the world that make grant funding available to groups that are doing what seem to us to be good citizenship kinds of things. So how they present themselves, what their branding or their public image is in an environment where the media is part of the contested environment, is a political challenge for them, to explain themselves in a way that makes sense to the Russian public and to counter the prevailing narrative that comes from state-controlled broadcast media.
I think we have to recognize that civil society, which is, I think, normally defined as being everything between the state and the family, still is struggling in Russia. I mean, partly because after so many years in which the family was pushed in on itself and the state excluded everything else, it created a very difficult environment for the growth of anything else, which is why, even when they try to create their own so-called Silicon Valley at Skolkovo, it's basically a state project. It means that NGOs have a hard time demonstrating their own worth. But NGOs have to demonstrate their own worth within their own context, or they don't deserve to survive. And like most business startups in most countries fail. Most business startups in this country fail. Well, there's no reason why most NGOs shouldn't fail. You have to demonstrate your own worth. And most NGOs in Russia, it seems to me, are not that big budget. The ability to develop grassroots sources of funding in a community, in a society, is, I think, absolutely critical. And the dependency relationships which have developed over the years, I think, have been, while understandable and well-intentioned, ultimately potentially debilitating. And I would say that I think for many Russian NGOs, it's probably, there's a benefit in dealing with, say, one of the German party Stiftungen than with an American body. Because even an American NGO has kind of the, the American flag on it in perceptions. And I think there's a good deal to be said in a Russian context where people think of themselves as being broadly culturally European, is less confrontational and perhaps more viable. And it's the kind of thing where perhaps Putin, when he's president again, won't want to have an argument with German Chancellor Merkel about interference with the role of the Adenauer or the Eber or the Naumann Stiftungen in Russia, where he wouldn't object to having a similar confrontation with his American counterpart. So I mean, these are just sort of notions, but I do think ultimately Russian NGOs have to prove their worth to Russians based on Russian support. And it's not going to be easy, but ultimately that's the only way you get real viability.
Yeah, I want to pick up on one sort of point here, and that is, we throw around the term civil society, which, as far as I knew, it became a bureaucratic term, sort of, 25 years ago or so. And before that, it was quite a different thing. I mean, fundamentally, civil society, as Wayne said, is everything between government and the family. That includes the private sector. It includes all of the cultural and educational institutions and so forth. I mean, it's a huge dimension. And narrowing it down to even to NGOs, in my view, is a very big mistake, because it doesn't truly reflect the dimension of civil society. So, I mean, what about churches or religious institutions, universities and the academy, the scientific and research establishments that aren't, directly working for some ministry? And if you look at it in that dimension, I mean, the extraordinary ballooning of and growth in the non-government dimension of Russian society in the last 20 years is quite astounding. And I would even say this is quite true in the NGO world. In my time, I don't know how many there are now, and you can get various numbers of 200,000 or whatever, most of which are not dealing with things we think about when we talk about NGOs. They're dealing with, PTAs, or they're supporting the local art museum, or whatever it may be. But they are NGOs. And frankly, they survive on the basis that Wayne points out, because they're not getting big bucks out of the foreign donors or anything else. They're getting it from local sources or from their own government. So the idea that civil society is in trouble because, Mr. Putin says some nasty things about foreign support for those concerned with a particular dimension of NGO activity, I think is a misreading of reality. And that brings up the second point. I mean, I think Wayne's point about the fact that NGOs rise and fall in their effectiveness based on their support from the people who actually care about them is very important. My experience in Russia over the 90s was that many did rise and then disappeared or whatever. Sometimes we would give them seed money and they would start something and it just didn't pick up. It didn't have sustainability. Others were extremely successful. I remember working with a women's group that worked on orphan issues. They got a start. We helped them organize. We gave them all of the knowledge you needed to sort of set themselves up. And then they went out and got money. They became a national network. So I think, the reality is here that we should not confuse civil society with, if you will, the human rights movement, which is a very different animal. I mean, it's a very specific one, and it's a perfectly legitimate one, but it isn't the only thing going. Nor, I would point out, is it necessarily the most influential of the civil society structures. I mean, the private sector is pretty important in Russia, number one. So, I mean, if we're going to, I include them in it. I also believe that things like the environmental movement, which has traditionally been an extremely important side of Russian activity in the civil society world, is still powerful. They changed the direction of the Trans-Siberian Railroad from Lake Baikal, I mean, et cetera. And I think, you don't do that easily. So, I mean, I think the reality here is, if you look at civil society as those things which are doing one of two things, either pushing the public authorities to go in certain directions when it affects civil interest, or doing those things what the government doesn't do. It's a pretty big area, and it's not going away in Russia. In fact, it's expanding.
I would note that I think the most widespread America-related NGO in Russia is Junior Achievement.
Yeah.
It's the second biggest junior achievement program in the world, and it was entirely a Russian initiative, which reached out to the American sort of mothership, but basically did it all with Russian organization, Russian resources.
I believe we have time for one final question, if there is one. Yes, sir.
Eric Schwartz, International Center for Journalists. Given the role that the new media, social media, however you want to term it, have played both in the democracy movement in the North Africa, Middle East, and also in the recent Russian protests, I'm curious if you see any signs of repression of, disruptions of service, internet service providers, et cetera. Obviously, journalists in Russia have been under pressure for a long time, quite, violent pressure. But are there any signs that the Putin administration might be taking a more technical avenue towards repressing that possible organizing factor for the opposition?
Well, I don't have, I'm not a member of the intelligence community, so I don't know, I suppose, answer definitively, but I don't think anybody's suggested that it's really, on a technical level, anything is happening particularly now. There are a couple of publicized arrests, which, some are taking as a message to people in the blogosphere and so forth. Maybe, we'll see. My personal view is that the Russian young people who are dealing with the internet and the social media are smart enough that they'll find a way around just about any technological gimmick that the authorities might try. And I think, the idea that Russia can, in some way, and I think this is the implication of what you're saying, get a handle on and control the information space again, I think it's just not on. I don't think it can happen. I mean, there are so many ways in which it is not controllable anymore, forgetting even the internet. I mean, I forgot how many million people traveled outside Russia last year, right? When I went to Moscow in the fall of 1990, there were 1,200 international phone lines, period, for the Soviet Union, right? And I remember going into a little room in the corner where a guy had a box, and he flipped a switch and turned on 64,000 of them, And, I mean, this kind of geometric explosion of connectivity is simply a fact, and it's not reversible. Why, they have 240 million cell phones. I mean, this is not manageable anymore. If there is anything that's possible, it may be that you will see efforts to shape the, the focus of the blogosphere, or, disinformation or whatever. I mean, all that kind of thing is out there. But that's just part of the world. I mean, that goes on in all of the internet, including anybody in this country. So, I mean, you have to take that as a given. But it seems to me that even if the intention is there, the capability, in my view, simply is not.
And there's another capability out there. Russia is generally rated to be the world's largest repository of computer hackers. And I would caution the government there to be very gentle about the extent to which you try to step on their corns, because we have seen the extent to which the digital world is one in which big institutions, governments and corporations and banks and networks, media are a lot more vulnerable to those guys than they are to us.
Indeed. Brilliant job, gentlemen. Thank you very much. And thank you all for attending. If you could join me in giving a round of applause for our speakers. I will remind everybody as well that a replay of the webcast, for those of you who want more, will be available soon on the IFES website. And lastly, I invite all of you to join us again here next week on Thursday for the next in the IFES series of discussions called Opening Doors, Electoral Participation of Persons with Disabilities. More information is available on our website as well. Again, thank you very much for coming. A splendid discussion. We look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you. Thanks, Ambassador. Appreciate it.
This is good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good. Thanks.